The mop handle hit the floor with a crack that I still hear sometimes when I close my eyes. My mother stood in the doorway of our apartment, the one she technically owned, the one she'd been letting us live in for 3 years without charging us a dime, holding a manila envelope stuffed with cash to cover our electric and gas bills for the summer. And my husband Garrett handed her a mop. Not as a joke, not with a laugh. He shoved that wooden handle toward her chest and said, "Since you're here, you might as well do something useful. Floors need mopping." I watched it happen like I was watching it through glass, like my brain refused to process the image. My mother, Diane, 61 years old, who had driven 40 minutes through a July heat wave to bring us money we desperately needed, standing there with a mop being pushed into her hands by the man I had married 34 years ago. She didn't say a word at first. She just looked at the mop. Then she looked at me, and something in her eyes, not hurt, not embarrassment, something quieter and colder than either of those, made my stomach drop straight through the floor. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the context. And trust me, even with the context, it barely makes sense. My name is Carol. I'm 54 years old. I've spent the last 26 years working as a cost estimator, a construction estimator to be specific, for a mid-sized general contracting firm out of a suburb about 20 miles east of Washington, D.C. It's not glamorous work. Most people don't even know what an estimator does. I spend my days reading blueprints, calculating material costs, writing up bid packages, negotiating with subcontractors, and making sure that when my company promises a client we can build something for a certain number, we actually can. It requires a particular kind of brain, methodical, detail-obsessed, not easily rattled. I was good at it. I still am. Garrett and I got married in the spring of 1991. I was 20 years old. He was 23. We were babies, honestly, but we didn't know that then. We'd met at a community college where we were both taking night classes, him for business administration, me working toward my associates before I transferred to finish my degree. He had this easy confidence that I mistook for stability. He laughed loudly, told stories well, and always seemed to know exactly what he wanted out of any room he walked into. I was drawn to that. I came from a quieter house, a more careful house, and Garrett felt like an open window. 30 flowing years, that's what we had. 3 decades and 4 more years of shared credit card statements and lease renewals and inside jokes and 2 cats, Pepper and Wick, a gray tabby and an all-black Tom who hated everyone except each other, and 1,000 small rituals that accumulate into a life. We'd had our rough patches, God knows. Money was always a tension between us. Garrett had never quite landed in a career the way I had. He'd cycled through sales jobs, a failed landscaping business, a stint managing a storage facility, a few years doing freelance bookkeeping for small businesses. None of it stuck. None of it paid reliably. For most of our marriage, I was the one carrying the weight of our finances, and for most of our marriage, I told myself that was okay. That was just how we were built. I was the planner, he was the dreamer. Plenty of marriages work that way. What I didn't fully account for was how that dynamic would calcify over time. How the dreamer would gradually stop dreaming and start resenting. How a man who once made you feel like you were the smartest person in the room can slowly, over years, begin making you feel like you're the problem. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. The apartment. Let me explain the apartment situation because it matters enormously to what happened. 3 years before that July, so the summer of 2021, Garrett and I had sold our house in Fairfax County. The sale wasn't voluntary in any meaningful sense. We'd fallen behind on the mortgage during a period when Garrett wasn't working, and my firm had cut everyone's hours during a slow quarter. We'd tried to refinance, tried to negotiate with the lender, and eventually, our options narrowed to selling or foreclosure. We sold. We walked away with about $40,000 in equity after everything was paid off, which sounds like something until you try to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in the DC metro area and realize your credit score from 18 months of late payments makes you basically untouchable to most landlords. My mother stepped in without being asked. She owned a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex in Annandale. She'd bought it years ago as an investment property and had been renting it out, but the tenants had just moved on. She called me and said, "You two can stay there, no rent. Just cover your own utilities and take care of the place." She didn't make a speech about it. She didn't ask for gratitude on any particular schedule. She just quietly solved our problem, the way she'd quietly solved problems my whole life. Diane had worked as a bookkeeper for 30 years. She was precise, frugal in the old-fashioned sense, and deeply private about money. She never discussed it loudly, never lorded anything over anyone. The apartment was a practical offering, not a power play. She wanted us to stabilize. She was giving us the runway to do it. Garrett was uncomfortable with it from the start. I could see that. The first week we moved in, he barely unpacked. He'd stand in the kitchen making coffee with this tight expression, like the walls were closing in. I thought it was just wounded pride, a man who'd once owned a house now living in his mother-in-law's apartment. I understood that. I gave him space around it, but the discomfort curdled into something uglier over those 3 years. He started making comments, small ones at first. "Your mother could at least update the fixtures in this bathroom." Or, "She's charging you nothing, but she can't be bothered to fix the HVAC when it acts up." Then bigger ones. He started calling the apartment the charity unit when he was irritated. He'd reference my mother's help with a particular edge in his voice, like it was a source of shame that was somehow her fault rather than a kindness she'd extended to us. I'd push back gently, and he'd dial it back, and then a few weeks later it would resurface with a little more corrosion on it. I want to be clear, our utilities during that period ran high. The building was older, the insulation wasn't great, and that particular July was punishing. Temperatures in the mid-90s for 2 straight weeks, the kind of heat that makes the air outside feel like a wet wool blanket pressed against your face. We were running the window units hard. The electric bill had come in at $340. Gas was another $80. I'd been stretched thin at work. Our firm had taken on a massive federal contract, and I was putting in 50, 60 hours a week, and some of my invoices had been delayed in processing. I'd mentioned to my mother very briefly that we were a little tight this month. She didn't ask questions. She just said she'd come by Saturday with something to help. Saturday was the 2nd week of July. It was brutal outside. My mother drove over in her old Buick, parked in the lot, climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. She had a bad knee. The stairs cost her something, and knocked on our door with that manila envelope in her hand. $450 in cash. Enough for both bills with a little buffer. I was in the bedroom when I heard the knock. Garrett was closer to the door. I heard him open it, heard my mother's voice. "Hi, Garrett, I just brought something for Carol." And then I heard nothing for a moment, just silence, and then his voice. "Here, since you're already here, floors could use a mop. Might as well make yourself useful." I came out of that bedroom so fast I nearly walked into the doorframe. He was actually holding the mop out to her. We kept it in the hallway closet, and he had apparently gotten it out while she was still in the doorway. He was standing there with this half-smirk that I recognized, the expression he wore when he thought he was being funny in a way that had a point to it. My mother was holding the envelope. The mop handle was extended toward her. "Garrett." My voice came out flat and strange. "What are you doing?" "Just making a joke," he said. "Diane gets it, right, Diane?" My mother looked at the mop. She looked at me. Then she looked at him. And slowly, without a word, she reached out and took it. Pepper, our gray tabby, had followed me out of the bedroom and was now sitting perfectly still in the middle of the hallway, watching the scene with the particular focused attention cats reserve for things that are about to go very wrong. Wick was somewhere in the living room. I could hear him shifting on the couch cushion. The apartment felt suddenly very small. My mother held that mop in both hands, and I waited for her to hand it back, to laugh it off, to say something sharp and dignified that would end the moment. Instead, she was quiet for what felt like a full minute, but was probably 10 seconds. Her jaw was set. Her eyes had gone somewhere I didn't recognize. And then she did something I did not expect at all. She turned around and mopped the floor. Not a token swipe, not a passive-aggressive drag of the mop across the tile to make a point. She actually mopped. She filled the bucket we kept under the sink. She knew where it was because she'd helped me unpack this kitchen 3 years ago. And she wrung out the mop head, and she started at the far end of the hallway and worked her way toward the living room, with the slow, deliberate strokes of a woman who had been doing her own floors for 40 years and knew exactly how it was done. Methodical, efficient, not a single wasted movement. Garrett stood there with his arms crossed, watching, and for the first 10 seconds he looked pleased with himself, like he'd won something. And then my mother said, quietly and without looking up from the floor, "Carol, why don't you put the kettle on?" Her voice was perfectly level. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request, really. It was the voice she used when she was managing a situation, and I recognized it from childhood. The voice that appeared when something needed to be handled without drama, without escalation, without giving anyone the satisfaction of a scene. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. My hands were shaking slightly. Pepper followed me in and sat next to the stove. Garrett drifted toward the living room and turned on the TV. By the time the water boiled, my mother had finished the hallway and was working on the kitchen tile. I made tea, the chamomile she'd always preferred, and set her mug on the counter and said her name softly. She glanced up. Her face was still composed, but her jaw was doing that thing where it went tight along the hinge. She'd had that jaw her whole life. I'd learned to read it. She finished the kitchen, leaned the mop against the wall, and washed her hands at the sink. She picked up her mug. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "Sit with me for a minute." We sat at the kitchen table. Garrett didn't come in. The TV murmured in the other room, some sports commentary, low and indistinct. My mother wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the window above the sink, and I waited. "He's not going to change," she said. I opened my mouth, and she shook her head once, just barely, and I closed it again. "I know you know that," she said. "I think you've known it for a long time. I'm not saying it to be cruel, and I'm not saying it to push you toward anything. I'm saying it because I want you to hear it from someone who loves you and isn't going to pretend anymore." The chamomile steam rose between us. Outside, a car pulled through the parking lot, its tires making that particular sound on summer asphalt, a low hiss. I stared at the grain of the kitchen table, a table I'd bought secondhand at an estate sale 6 years ago, in a different house, in a different version of my life. "He handed you a mop," I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. "He did," she said, "in your own apartment." "Yes." She set her mug down. "Carol, I need to tell you something. I've been sitting on it for a while, and I wasn't sure if it was my place, but after today, I think it is." She looked at me directly, and that cold, quiet thing was back in her eyes, clearer now, focused. "Last month, when I came to drop off those extra towels you asked for, you weren't home yet. Garrett let me in. While I was in the linen closet, I heard him on the phone in the bedroom." She paused. "He wasn't talking to a client." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "What do you mean?" "I don't know who he was talking to," she said carefully. "I couldn't hear the words clearly, but I know the tone. I know what a man sounds like when he's talking to someone he doesn't want his wife to know about." She held my gaze. "I'm 61 years old, Carol. I was married to your father for 22 years. I know that tone." The kettle had gone cold. Pepper had moved from the stove to underneath my chair and was pressing his warm weight against my ankle. I focused on that, the physical fact of it, something warm and solid and real, because the rest of the room had gone slightly unreal around me. "You should have told me," I said, and I wasn't angry at her exactly, but the words came out with an edge I hadn't planned. "I know," she said simply. "I'm telling you now." Garrett didn't say anything after she left. He just watched some game on TV and later made himself a sandwich and went to bed. I sat in the kitchen until almost midnight, listening to the window units cycle on and off, thinking about the phone call my mother had described, thinking about the particular expression on Garrett's face when he'd handed her that mop. Not cruelty exactly, but a kind of contempt, a casual dismissal, as if her dignity were a minor inconvenience. As if the roof over our heads were just a backdrop. I told myself to wait, to think, to be methodical about this the way I was methodical about everything else in my professional life. I was a cost estimator. I lived in the gap between what things looked like they would cost and what they actually cost. I knew how to read the fine print. I knew how to find the number buried in the footnotes that changed everything. I started paying attention differently after that. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't install spyware or hire anyone or go through his phone while he slept. I just started noticing. The small withdrawals from our joint account that appeared on Fridays, 40 here, 60 there, just under the threshold I'd set for automatic transfer alerts. The Tuesday afternoons he said he was meeting with a bookkeeping client in Alexandria and came home smelling like he'd been somewhere with air conditioning and a bar menu. The way his phone screen went dark the moment I walked into a room, a gesture so practiced it had become unconscious. I kept a list in a notes app on my phone, the same one I used for bid calculations at work. Dates, amounts, observations. I noted them the same way I noted discrepancies in a subcontractor's quote, without emotion, without conclusion, just data. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with it. I just knew that I needed it. The thing about working in construction estimating for 26 years is that you develop a very specific relationship with documents. You understand that the paper record is the only record that matters when things go wrong. Verbal agreements evaporate, mesmer shift. But a dated invoice, a signed change order, a bank statement with a highlighted line, those stay. Those hold up. I started pulling together our financial picture in a way I hadn't done in years, probably because I'd always managed our money and assumed I understood it. But I'd been managing it on autopilot, focused on the current month's numbers, not looking at the pattern over time. When I actually sat down with 3 years of statements, what I found made my stomach hurt in a new and specific way. We had less than I thought we did. Not dramatically less, not ruinously less, but consistently, persistently less. Money had been leaving our accounts in amounts and patterns that didn't match our expenses. Not all at once, gradually. The financial equivalent of a slow leak in a wall, the kind that only shows up when the drywall has already rotted through. I called my college roommate, Priya, who was now a CPA working out of an office in Bethesda. We'd stayed close over the years, the way you stay close with someone who knew you before you became whoever you became. I hadn't told her much about our financial situation. I hadn't told anyone much, because Garrett and I had always kept our struggles private, and because some part of me had always felt a low-grade shame about the fact that I carried our finances while he cycled through jobs. I'd protected that shame carefully for years, the way you protect a bruise without ever examining what caused it. I met Priya for lunch at a diner in Silver Spring on a Thursday. I told Garrett I had a site visit in that direction, which wasn't entirely untrue since I drove past a project on my way. I brought a folder with printed statements and the notes from my phone, and I put them on the table between us and said, "I need you to tell me what you see." She looked at them for a long time. She asked 2 clarifying questions, both of them very precise, the way she always asked questions. Then she looked up at me over the rim of her glasses and said, "Carol, you need to talk to a family law attorney before you do anything else." "I'm not sure I'm at that point yet," I said. "I know you're not sure," she said, "but these patterns," she tapped the statements with one finger, "these are not random. Someone has been very deliberately keeping amounts below alert thresholds. This isn't careless spending. This is managed." She paused. "Who manages your accounts?" "We both have access, but I'm the one who usually—" "Who set up the accounts?" I stopped. Garrett had set up 2 of our 3 accounts. Years ago, when we'd switched banks after the house sale. I'd been so slammed with work during that period that I'd handed him the task and not thought much about it. He'd added me as a joint holder, but he'd been the primary on both. "Pull the full transaction history," Priya said. "Not just the statements, the actual transaction records, every line. And Carol," she waited until I looked at her directly, "do it from a device he doesn't have access to, and don't tell him you're doing it." I drove back to Annandale in the July heat, with the air conditioning in my car blowing full blast and my mind running calculations I'd never wanted to run. The numbers on those statements, the Tuesday afternoons, the phone going dark, the mop, my mother mopping her own apartment floor while the man I'd spent 34 years with stood there with his arms crossed and a smirk that now, in retrospect, looked less like carelessness and more like a statement of some kind, a declaration of exactly how much he valued the people who were keeping us afloat. I parked in the lot and sat in the car for a few minutes. The building's second-floor walkway was empty in the heat. I could see our window, the curtains I'd hung 3 years ago, pale blue, slightly faded now from the sun. Inside that apartment, Garrett was probably on the couch, probably on his phone. I took mine out and opened the Notes app. I added a line at the bottom: "Contact family law attorney. Research, Fairfax County, initial consultation." Then I looked up and saw, in the window of the apartment directly across the parking lot, something that made my breath stop for a full 3 seconds. Garrett, standing at a window that wasn't ours, in an apartment I didn't recognize, talking to someone I couldn't see. He was animated in a way he almost never was at home anymore, hands moving, head tilted, something that looked almost like laughter crossing his face. He hadn't seen me. My car was just another car in a full lot on a hot Thursday afternoon. I sat very still. My phone was still in my hand. I opened the camera. I took 3 photos before he stepped back from the window and disappeared into the room. My hands were not shaking anymore. That was the strange part. They were completely, unnervingly steady. I looked at the photos on my screen, blurry with distance, but clear enough. The window, the building number visible on the wall behind him, his face in profile, unmistakable. I put the car in reverse and pulled out of the lot. I drove to the far end of the complex, parked again, and sat there thinking about the fact that my husband had, apparently, been spending time in someone else's apartment in the same building where we lived, in the building owned by my mother, while I was at work estimating costs for federal construction contracts, and my mother was driving 40 minutes through a heat wave to bring us money for the electric bill. The numbers in my Notes app stared back at me. The photos sat in my camera roll. The name of a family law attorney in Fairfax County was now in my search history on a phone that only I had ever touched. I was 54 years old. I had spent 26 years learning that the paper record is the only record that holds up when everything else falls apart. I was about to start building MineDot. The attorney's name was Miriam Okafor. Priya had referred her, said she was the sharpest family law practitioner in Fairfax County, that she had a particular gift for cases involving what Priya called financial opacity, which was her careful accountant's way of saying a spouse who moved money like he didn't want it found. Miriam's office was in a low brick building off Route 50, nothing fancy, a waiting room with good light and no magazines about celebrity weddings. I liked her immediately. She had the kind of stillness that comes from having heard everything and being surprised by none of it. I sat across from her with my folder, the printed statements, the notes from my phone, the 3 photographs from the parking lot, and I laid it out in the order I'd assembled it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at the photographs for a long moment, and then set them face down on the desk with the particular care of someone who understood exactly what they represented. "The apartment in the same complex," she said. "Do you know who lives there?" "I ran the building's unit directory on the complex website," I said. "The unit he was standing in is listed as rented to a woman named Serena Vogel." "I don't know her. I'd never heard that name before." Miriam wrote it down. "How long have you been in the building?" 3 years. She looked up. "And the apartment your mother owns, she's the title holder?" "Yes, she's let us live there rent-free since 2021. "Does your husband's name appear anywhere on the deed or lease?" "There's no formal lease. My mother drafted a simple occupancy agreement when we moved in. My name is on it. His isn't." Something shifted in Miriam's expression. Not a smile exactly, but a kind of quiet recognition. "All right," she said. "Here's what I want you to do." She walked me through it methodically. Request full transaction records from both accounts Garrett had set up, going back to the date they were opened. Do it online, from my own device, and save everything as PDFs. Document the pattern of withdrawals. Separately, I should have Priya run a formal forensic summary, not an audit, just a structured accounting of the discrepancies I'd already identified, formatted in a way that would hold up if we needed it later. And I should not, under any circumstances, confront Garrett yet. "The moment he knows you know," Miriam said, "money starts moving faster. It's reflex. People who have been managing a financial situation like this for years don't need time to think about what to do next. They've already thought about it." I drove home that afternoon and sat in the parking lot again, force of habit now, looking at the building's second floor. The curtains in Serena Vogel's unit were closed. Our curtains, pale blue and sun-faded, were open. I could see the ceiling fan turning slowly through the glass. I did what Miriam told me to do. It took me 3 weeks of careful, methodical work, spread across lunch breaks and early mornings before Garrett was up. I pulled every record. I called Priya and she came over one Saturday afternoon when Garrett said he was running errands. I watched his car pull out of the lot and then watched, from our window, whether it went left toward Route 7 or right toward the far end of the complex. It went left. I let out a breath. Priya sat at my kitchen table with her laptop and a yellow legal pad and worked through the numbers with the focused efficiency of someone dismantling a machine to find which part had been modified. By the time she closed her laptop, we had a clear picture. Over 31 months, approximately $14,000 had moved out of our joint accounts in increments that were almost, but not quite, invisible. Almost. "He's been doing this for at least 2.5 years, Priya said. She wasn't angry, she was just precise, the way she always was, but her voice was doing something careful around the edges. "Carol, this is a long time." "I know," I said. Pepper jumped onto the table between us, and Priya scratched him behind one ear without looking away from me. "Are you okay?" "I'm building a record," I said. "That's what I'm doing right now. I'll be okay after that." She nodded once, accepting that, the way she'd always accepted the way I processed things, from the outside in, the facts first, the feelings later, when there was room for them. Miriam filed the petition in early September. I was at work when it was served. I'd timed it deliberately. I'd told Garrett I had a full-day site visit in Prince William County, which was true, and I'd arranged with the building's leasing office to allow the process server access at 11 in the morning. By the time I drove back into Annandale that evening, the thing was done. Garrett had been served divorce papers in the apartment my mother owned on a Tuesday afternoon, probably while his phone was going dark in his hand. He called me 6 times between noon and 5 o'clock. I let them all go to voicemail. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my project site and read Miriam's confirming text and felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, not grief, not even satisfaction, just stillness. The particular stillness of a calculation that is finally balanced. When I walked into the apartment that evening, Garrett was sitting at the kitchen table. The papers were in front of him. He looked up when I came in, and his face went through 4 different expressions in about 2 seconds: surprise, anger, something that looked almost like fear, and then the performance of calm that he'd been using on me for years. He settled on that one. "You want to tell me what this is?" he said. I set my bag down by the door. "You know what it is." "Carol, don't." I pulled out the chair across from him and sat. "I know about the accounts. I know about the $14,000. And I know about Serena Vogel." The performance of calm collapsed. His jaw went tight, the same jaw tightening I'd watched my mother do at this same table 6 weeks ago. But on him, it looked different. On him, it looked like a man realizing the ground had already shifted and he'd been the last to notice. "You've been going through our accounts," I said, jointly held. "I pulled records I'm legally entitled to pull." I folded my hands on the table. "Miriam Okafor is my attorney. She's already filed. The financial documentation goes to Discovery. All of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said with a particular bitterness that I recognized as the last weapon left in the cabinet, "Your mother is going to love this." And there it was, even now at this table, with divorce papers in front of him and documented evidence of 31 months of systematic financial deception. His instinct was to reach for my mother as a pressure point, the woman who had driven 40 minutes in a July heat wave to bring us money, the woman he'd handed a mop. I looked at him for a long moment. "My mother," I said, "has already spoken with Miriam about the occupancy arrangement. You have 30 days from the date of service to vacate this apartment. That's in the filing." I stood up. "I'd suggest you start packing." He stared at me. "You can't just—" "It's her apartment, Garrett. Your name was never on anything. Miriam was very clear about what that means." He left 14 days later, not because he had to, he had 30, but because Serena Vogel's lease was apparently up and she'd already been looking at a place in Arlington. And I suspect he'd rather have been anywhere than in those rooms with me and the evidence of what he'd done arranged neatly in a folder on the kitchen counter. He took his clothes, his bookkeeping files, the television from the bedroom, and one of the 2 cast-iron skillets. He left Wick and Pepper without discussion, which told me everything I needed to know about the nature of his attachments. The divorce took 7 months. Virginia requires a 1-year separation period for contested divorces, but ours was ultimately uncontested. Miriam was very good, and the financial documentation was very clear, and Garrett's attorney, a soft-spoken man named Douglas who looked perpetually exhausted, apparently advised his client early on that contesting the documented transfers would not go well for him. We settled. The $14,000 was factored into the division. He got less than he'd expected. I got more than I'd feared. My mother came over the weekend after he left. She brought food, a casserole she'd made, a loaf of bread, a container of the soup she'd been making for me since I was sick as a child. She sat at the kitchen table while I reheated the soup, and we talked about ordinary things, her knee, which was better after a cortisone shot, a book she'd been reading, the particular way the light came through the kitchen window in September. We didn't talk about Garrett. We didn't need to. At some point, she looked around the apartment, the kitchen, the hallway, the clean floors, and she said, "I always thought this was a good space, good bones." "It is," I said. "You should stay as long as you need," she said. "You know that." "I know." I set her soup in front of her and sat across from her with my own. "Mom, the day you came with the money, the day he—" "I remember," she said. "Why did you mop the floor?" She picked up her spoon and considered the soup for a moment. Pepper was on the chair beside her, the one he'd claimed as his since the day we moved in. His gray weight settled comfortably against her arm. She reached over and scratched him once between his ears, and then she looked at me with those eyes that had gone cold and quiet in the doorway 6 weeks ago, and were now simply warm and clear and very tired. "Because I needed him to see," she said, "that there is nothing he could hand me that I couldn't handle, and I needed you to see that too." I looked at my soup, The steam rose off it in the September afternoon light. Outside, a car moved through the parking lot. Just a car, just a Thursday, nobody I needed to watch through a camera lens. "Did it work?" I said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "You filed, didn't you?" I smiled. It was the first real smile I'd managed in weeks. "Yeah," I said. "I filed." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sigh, but was somewhere between them. The sound of a woman who had been patient for a very long time and had finally been proven right about something she'd never wanted to be right about. She picked up her spoon. I picked up mine. Wick appeared from the living room, stretched once in the doorway with the boneless extravagance of a cat who owned the place, and then settled on the kitchen floor in a patch of afternoon sun. It took me another 14 months to fully stabilize. My credit score, which had taken the hit from the Fairfax house, climbed back past 720 by the following spring. I tracked it the way I tracked material costs on a project, checking it monthly, watching the line move. Priya helped me open 2 accounts in my name only. I renegotiated my salary at work, the first time I'd done that in 6 years, and got a 12% increase that I should have asked for 3 years earlier. I paid my mother back the $450. I put it in an envelope and drove it to her house on a Saturday morning, and she tried to refuse it, and I said, "You carried us for 3 years. The least I can do is cover July." And eventually she took it, with a look that I chose to read as respect. I'm still in the apartment. The pale blue curtains are still a little faded, but I bought new ones for the bedroom, a deep rust color that I like the way the afternoon light hits. The HVAC was finally replaced by the complex last spring, and the electric bills have dropped by almost $80 a month. Pepper is 11 now. Slower than he used to be, more interested in sun patches than in following me from room to room. Wick, who was always the bolder of the two, started sitting on the windowsill in the evenings and watching the parking lot with the patient attention of an animal who has decided this place is his and intends to keep it that way. Serena Vogel moved to Arlington. I have no feelings about her. She was a variable in someone else's calculation, and I stopped being interested in those a long time ago. Garrett is in Richmond now, as far as I know. We have not spoken since the settlement was signed. I have no feelings about that either. Or rather, I have feelings about it, but they are quiet ones, the kind that don't need an audience. What I think about sometimes is my mother standing in that doorway.